in a private school or religious school, they're the ones that are going to benefit, they're going to get the vouchers. And so don't let anybody fool you that that's not going to happen here in the 7th District. It is. So we need to do everything we can to protect public schools. I'm very concerned about IDEA, which is Individual with Disability Education Act. You sign away your rights once you go to a private school. None of those things go with you. So if you hear otherwise, it's just a lot of baloney. And I'm looking at my watch now, so I'm going to sit down. But I've had, like I said, I've spent a lifetime working for public education. I will resist. And I'm reminded of an axiom I heard recently, which is this. We're all afraid of what's coming down the pike, right? It said, the devil whispered in my ear, a storm is coming. But I grabbed the devil by the shirt and I said, I am the storm.
Yes!
All right, good evening. Thank you for having me here tonight. I'm going to shift the debate a bit to an issue that's a little more focused on Virginia itself, and that's the issue of equitable funding. So one of my key reasons for going into education law and policy, representing school districts, and then working at the U.S. Department of Education was to address this question of why do we give some children a really wonderful education and give other children a really low quality education? How did we get here? And so in my research and my work, I focus on how does the law contribute to that, but also more importantly, what should we do about it? What tools do we have to do something about this challenge? So Virginia is like many states in which we have significant disparities in quality throughout the state, both within districts and between districts. And so the challenge is sort of how did we get here? Part of how we got here is in the state of Virginia, we never fully dismantled the legacy of Jim Crow. So what happened, as you all know, everyone, all school children learned about Brown versus Board of Education, and the Supreme Court declared an end to separate but equal. So actually what happened after Brown, though, and after the court eventually issued some decisions saying you do need to desegregate the schools and you need to do it now, after the court, responded to the massive resistance throughout the South, and schools eventually began to desegregate. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court eventually started issuing rulings that limited the scope of desegregation. So it said you can't desegregate across district lines unless you have interdistrict segregation. You show, instead of saying you must show that you have an effective plan, you just have to show that you had made a good faith effort to implement your plan. And so what we saw is a variety of rollbacks from what was intended to dismantle Jim Crow. So what happened is, in Brown versus Board of Education, we sort of broke up with Jim Crow. But we kept around a lot of mementos and sort of photos. Kind of, we're still reading the letters. And so the challenge has been that we did not, as a state and as a nation, put in the same amount of effort into dismantling Jim Crow that we put into creating Jim Crow. Jim Crow was a system that was, very thorough, well thought out. It was very clear about how lines were to be divided. And unfortunately, we did not put the same effort and money and decades and energy and enthusiasm into putting an end and burying Jim Crow. We just sort of broke up with Jim Crow. And so now what you see is sort of the remnants and the memories of Jim Crow linger in our education system. They linger in a system of separate and unequal schools. They linger in increasing racial isolation in our schools. And so one of the challenges is, what can we do about it? What can we do about the fact that we really never buried Jim Crow? So one of the things I focus on, as I said, is equitable funding, and I'll just give you sort of one data point, because I find when I talk too deeply about school funding, people's eyes sort of glaze over a little bit. As a scholar, I get very excited about these things, so I'm going to focus on one measure. So one of the things that research shows is very effective is to provide low-income communities with additional resources. This is not rocket science. Okay, but for many years, research has shown that low-income communities need more resources than middle-income and higher-income communities. In fact, the research shows they need about 40% more resources to compete on an even playing field with middle-income families. So then the key question you want to know is, what does Virginia do with low-income communities? Virginia gives about 86 cents on the dollar to low-income communities in state and local funding. So what we have in Virginia is a regressive funding system. We give less funding to low-income communities than we do wealthier communities. This is state and local funding. I'm taking federal funding out of the equation. And if you want to see this data, there's a 2017 report, just came out last month. It's called Is Funding Fair? Is Funding Fair? And you can track Virginia across multiple fairness measures. I'm just giving you one. And so one of the challenges within Virginia, I think, that we need to begin to address is this consistent refusal to invest in other people's children. What we say is, well, this is not our responsibility, or I'm going to focus the resources on my child's school, or I want to make this child's school great, or I want to, focus on this group of kids. When in fact, you are going to pay now, or you're going to pay later. And so, the challenge is that if you don't invest in equitable and excellent schools at the front end, you pay for it on the back end with higher crime rates, lower civic involvement, worse healthcare outcomes. We have a panel about that coming up. There's just a number of outcomes that are worse when you don't invest in excellent schools for all children. And so Virginia has a long way to go on this issue, and I'll just give you one last point. When you think about education, many people say Virginia has these wonderful schools. We have really high quality schools. I'm here to tell you that if you take Northern Virginia off, we look a whole lot like Mississippi and Alabama. And Virginians don't like to think of themselves as Mississippians and Alabamans. They're like, oh, we're much more, refined than that. But unfortunately, our education system and the outcomes we get are not. And so I think we have a long way to go to figure out how to make the investments in not only our own children and families, but also other people's children, to make sure that we have a robust and excellent system of education for all children in the Commonwealth.
Hi, I'm just going to maybe add one piece to this conversation, and I want to get to the questions. So I think what we can say is that right now we're in a place where public education is under attack, and I'm somebody that's a product of public education. I'm from public schools. I'm worked in public schools.